Okay, we ready to get going?
So welcome. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me in the back?
No.
How can you answer if you don't hear me?
We didn't hear that either. We can see your lips move.
Yeah, that's great. So good morning again. Hi in the back, you can hear me? Very good. Can you read this? If you can't, then you have to move to the front. You know, that's how you solve these kind of problems. We have space here. You can actually get a table where you can put your notebook on. It's actually convenient. Yeah. So, welcome everybody to the IETF 92. I always wanted to open an IETF meeting, so now I finally get to this. That's wonderful. This is the Netmod working group. We have 2 meetings this time. This is the first time. The next Netmod meeting is tomorrow. So if you enjoy the meeting, you can come back tomorrow. We'll see how that works. Today we are going to focus on the Yang language infrastructure and then later on move into data modeling, and tomorrow it will all be focused on data modeling work. First things first, the blue sheets are circulating, so please sign in when they pass by. We have a Java scribe who is still working on getting on Java. We have minute taker, right? Who is minute taker? There's a minute taker, great. Is someone else on Java here in the room? Nobody? Could someone try to get on Java here in the room so that we can actually see if someone remotely wants to ask a question? We need a volunteer. There's something in return for that, which we have lost. You get stickers, right? You can accumulate stickers this week. Yeah? If you're very active and taking notes and JavaScribing, you will have your whole notebook filled with stickers at the end of the week. Yeah? So start now. JavaScribe. Lada, can you join Java? Thank you, it always works. So we have everything administratively set. So we go quickly through the status of the working group and the agenda. I have to stand here. So for those who present, there's a marker here that's new. You have to stand here in order to present. There's a camera, smile, make sure everything looks good, and don't run around. Note well, please take care. It's the Monday morning. You might have forgotten about it since the last IETF meeting, or if it's the first IETF meeting, you haven't seen it. So take a note what the rules of procedure are here in terms of what you say. It's a contribution to the standards process, and everybody in here is allowed to use it. Read the details, follow the pointers. Next slide. This is our growing list of RFCs that the working group has published. The last one is in bold because that came out since the last IETF. So we're happy to have one more RFC published. Next slide. This is the set of working group drafts that we have, grouped into Yang language and infrastructure and data models. So we go through the first part first today, and then we slowly move to the second part, and we'll have also discussions and presentations about other data models that people propose to work on in this working group today and tomorrow, so there's going to be more. Agenda for today, administrative things, that's what we're currently doing. We then go on Yang 1.1, something that we started about a year ago, which we should ideally wrap up soon. The Yang guidelines revision, that is coming along with the new Yang version. The Yang encoding for JSON is a document which should be almost complete. We'll talk about that. And then there's any other business on the language infrastructure part of the session. And afterwards, we go into data modeling. So we start with the syslog data model. I'm not sure who's presenting it. Do you know? Okay, we'll find out by that time. Okay, great. There's an Anti-MIP Yang design team that just started. They probably tell us a little bit of what they're doing and what their goals and plans are. And there's going to be a time, hopefully, for another document which talks about an inventory extension of a topology data model. That's the plan for today, and that's the plan for tomorrow. So administrative agenda bashing first again. Yang data model coordination. Benoit wants to say something. What's happening in the IETF in order to control the many data models that are currently being submitted. We talk about the ACL data model, the core routing data model, which are working group items, and then data model classification and the modeling of operational state, individual submission, the organization of Yang modules, individual submission, the diffserv data model, and the peer bound requirements and any other business on the data modeling front. Any requests to change the agenda? There will be in between Benoit coming up, giving a short report of what happened during the weekend on the tools front, but that's a little detail. Anything else that people want to add, change, remove? Doesn't seem to be the case. Then we move to Yang 1.1. Martin?
Can you hear me? No? Louder? Because
No, Martin, it works. It's just
yeah, but so you can't hear me now? You're back? Or no? Or yes? Like that? It's better?
no.
Yes. Well, but this works, I think. All right. So we're gonna continue with the Yang 1.1 issue list and continue the discussions that we have had on the virtual interims. So I don't have any slides. We will work off the issues.txt list that you can see up there soon. This is the summary. So Jürgen sent out a summary of where we are with all the issues earlier today, and I believe this table. Okay, right. So we have one issue in the new state, and that has to do with coexistence between Yang 1.1 and Yang 1.0. It's more or less a placeholder issue that we probably need to discuss here today. There are a bunch of dead issues. There are 3 open issues. That means that we have, for some of them, I guess we have solution proposals, but some of them don't even have solution proposals. So these are the ones that we need to discuss today. So what do you can do? You want to do anything about those in the verify state? Okay. Here? No. Okay, fine. So let's start with them then. So there were 2 issues that we discussed at the last virtual interim, and we have a proposal for them, and they went, I guess they went, or going into the verify state now, because you can send them to the mailing list. And the first one is about the NXML statement. We've had a long discussion about the NXML statement. The problem with NXML is that it really just works for the XML encoding, but now we're seeing that RESTCOM, for example, is using JSON, and there might be other protocols that want to use some other encoding like CBOR, and NXML doesn't really work in those cases. So the proposed solution is this Y3405, and the idea is to keep NXML as it is. It's actually needed in the netconf protocol module, which is XML specific, but then introduce a new statement called AnyData that can be encoded to XML or to JSON or to CBOR or whatever encoding of Yang we have. So the idea is to have a more generic thing that can be encoded in the encoding that the protocol is using. It would also have slightly different semantics. NXML is supposed to model any chunk of XML, including mixed content and processing instructions and all that, whereas AnyData would be a chunk of data that has been modeled by Yang. So it's a subset. So when you encode AnyData into XML, it's going to be a subset of what's allowed in NXML. So, any comments on this one? Or people agree that this is a good solution? I assume that there will be time to comment on the mailing list as well. Did you send out a date, an end date? That's a good sign. All right. Okay. The next one has to do with the conformance. We've had lots of discussions. Okay, Phil?
Could you eat the mic a little more? You're here.
Okay, I will try.
Thank you.
So we've had lots of discussions on conformance, and at the last virtual interim we talked about solution 02. So maybe you can bring that up. So the solution is the proposed solution is pretty simple. It is to not allow value space changes in type defs and groupings. So currently in Yang 1.0, you are allowed to extend the value space of a type def when you update the module, and you're allowed to add stuff to a grouping when you update the module. So the proposed solutions here is to not allow that, which means that once a module uses a type def or a grouping, it will always be clear what the semantics of that type def or grouping is, and semantic and syntax.
Raja Utka, I'm
personally not very happy with this solution. I think it's way too strict, because the groupings, especially type defs maybe too, need to be developed in time, and of course the solution of creating a new grouping or type def every time it changes means that the modules will become unreadable. So if we have like 5 versions of essentially the same grouping, then I don't think that this will work well. In my opinion, the problem with groupings and type def specifically is that the import statement is used for several different cases. Apart from groupings and type defs, it's also used in a different way for augments. And maybe if we can clarify and separate these two cases, we can come up with a solution that could be good for groupings and type defs, even though they may change between different revisions. And one solution could be that, in fact, we should be able to determine the revision of every grouping or type def from the importing module. So either the revision is specified or the revision is set to the revision that was available at the moment that the importing module was published. And of course it means that for a given server, several different revisions of the same module that's used for groupings and type defs might be needed, but that's probably the best solution we can come up. I don't know what's the problem with this, so we can discuss it.
Yeah, I mean, we've been going back and forth for quite some time on this, and I agree that this isn't the best solution, or it isn't the perfect solution that makes everyone happy. I agree that, but I think that this is the solution that the only solution that we.
I'm sorry, I missed the interim where this was discussed and decided. Sorry.
But I mean, having implicit, you're more or less saying that if you don't have a import by revision, you have an implicit import by revision.
Right, and that will be fixed.
Really, right, so
no
that is really just a syntactic sugar for having import by revision everywhere. And we have documented the problems with that.
What are the problems, actually? Can you repeat that?
So we have this draft that talks about the different problems, and Andy has one and I have one. We try to harmonize them.
I read the draft and I tried to open this discussion in the mailing list a few weeks ago, but I actually didn't get any answer to this question, so I'm really wondering where the problems are. I can imagine there are problems if you import without a revision and then you don't know which revision is actually used on either side, but this is
again,
not
what you're
easy.
proposing is really import by revision everywhere. And then you get into the problem of updating, as soon as you update one of the modules and you want to push that change to the other modules, you will have to update all of those and so on. So you get this ripple effect where you have to more or less update all your modules.
No, there's no ripple effect, because if you update the imported module, it doesn't change anything for the importing module. That importing module will still use the old revision of the module with groupings or type defs, right?
So what does that mean for augments then?
What does it mean for?
For augments.
Well, augments are of course different, because if you create an augment, you also have to take into account that target node that's implemented by the server, because that's where you put the new stuff. So that's why I'm saying that really import is overloaded in a way that it used. In fact, for augments, what you need the import for is only to get some mapping from a module name to the prefix that you used for target node. Otherwise, the import is completely irrelevant. So that's why I think that perhaps we could separate like this assignment of a prefix to a module name, separated from the revision with which the modules are imported.
That sounds like a bigger
okay, we can
solution.
discuss it, but I just wanted to say that I am not happy with the solution to fix all groupings and type defs forever, or create new groupings with new names each time a change is needed.
Andy Bierman, I agree with Martin that the ripple effect is a problem. The problem shows up when you have more than one definition in the module, which is always the case. And you want to use the new module for some new type def, so you have to update your import by revision clause, which means that everything else in the module updates to the newest version. And if you wanted to freeze a type def at a certain value, the 1 to 10 instead of the 1 to 20, you can't do that, because you can't have version 1 of this type def and then version 5 of this type def. You have to pick an entire module version. And so the ripple effect comes into play as soon as you want to use something out of a newer version. And in an SMI world, we try to completely avoid multiple revisions of the same thing, such that the latest version of the module that a server supported would continue to work. I think that's what we need to do here as well. And although we might end up with multiple revisions of a grouping or something like that, I think the new revision will match something new that it's modeling. If it's a new revision of a protocol, it'll have the new name, and then when it's used elsewhere in the system, you have to explicitly change it in order to pick up the new type or the new grouping, and I like that feature.
Pusher from Juniper Networks. So what you're doing is you're putting the cost of versioning on the publisher of the module, not on the user. So if I make 5 different revisions of a grouping, I have to carry 5 different revisions of that grouping in my module, even though I publish 5 different versions of it. If you take the case that Andy just said, if someone is reusing version 1 of my grouping, if I was allowed to change that grouping as I change the module, then the user of version 1, when he goes to update to the version of my module that contains version 5, has the choice of either adopting to version 5 or recreating that grouping or type def himself. The cost is carried by the person reusing it if they're not willing to move to the modern version. So it's a smaller cost. It's carried in fewer places, and in most cases it won't even be a problem. I don't need to make grouping 1, grouping 2, grouping 3, grouping 4, grouping 5 if nobody's using them. It's just a cost that I don't have to bear.
Yomushanga standing in the auditorium. The problem with this is that if you do this in 100 different modules, then 100 different modules are going to copy the old definition from the single place into their own space. I don't see why that would be necessarily simpler.
So if a type is well used, then it may be worth revisioning it, but it should be the choice of the module owner. It shouldn't be every single version gets, every single grouping in type def carries this cost.
I don't know how often this case will actually happen, that somebody will need to use different versions of different 2 groupings from different revisions of a module, but I think it would be only in some transient case that somebody is not able to adjust to the new revision of a grouping. So I agree with Phil, actually, that would be an easy solution. If somebody really wants to do that, there is always the option to copy the new revision of the grouping to his own module. It doesn't change any namespaces or whatever, because the groupings adopt the namespace of the importing module, right? So as soon as the situation stabilizes, then a new revision of the module can use just the same revision of the imported module for all groupings, and the situation should stabilize. I'm mostly concerned about this development phase when we are developing AI modules for different areas, and we will every once in a while need to go back and revise some groupings, for example, because new module reveals some problems with the old version. So after it stabilizes, I don't think it will be any problem with revisions at all. But if we really fix everything to be cast in stone, it won't work at this stage.
Yeah, so, I mean, we've been discussing this for almost a year. We had the interim in New York, where we spent 2 days for this, and we had virtual interims and some discussions on the mailing list. So at this point, if someone has, a better solution, then I think we need a concrete proposal that covers everything, and not just, hand waves across and says that, oh, okay, augment will have to be treated in a different way, unclear how. Right? So, yeah, I don't know how to handle this.
Yeah, it's very important to understand that, very important to understand that there are many details that interact here. And if you take out one little detail, you can come up with a solution how to fix that, but it breaks something else. So we have gone through many different variations of what might be possible solution path, and we always came back into a situation where things did conflict. And so that's why we ended up with this solution, which is relatively simplistic, but it's completely predictable. And you can publish it, and that's very important. You can publish it without knowing who's actually using your stuff. And you just keep it out there. So if someone is using that stuff, it's not automatically by just pulling in a new import because you want to use a new type def. It doesn't mean that as a side effect many other things change, right? You have to explicitly adopt the change, rather than explicitly having to change things back to the old version if you don't want to adopt the change. And that is considered by many people to be way more robust than actually relying on everybody figuring out what needs to be changed now in my module such that I stay the same as I was before.
Andy Bierman, I would point out that import by revision is not being used everywhere. It's really a burden to do it, especially if you're developing your own modules. In development, constantly changing the revision, or even worse, having multiple different copies of the Yang module all with the same revision date gets to be a problem. I am real concerned about this notion of pulling in the grouping from another module and cut and pasting it into the module that's using it. That completely ignores the reason why we had the grouping in the first place. Someone decided it should be defined over here. And so if you make a copy of it and change it slightly, that sounds like the worst possible solution.
So I understand that this is the simplest answer. It's also the most expensive and the most painful. I mean, it's the most bulletproof and the most pessimistic. What I hope for is a lighter thing. Addressing Andy's comment, the issue of modules in development, that's exactly what the revisionless import without revision was meant for things where you're in a more fluid state. So you wouldn't expect a module like that to use import by revision.
So taking the chair's position, Jürgen Schönwelder again, I think we're going to send this out for verify, but people need to understand that we have gone through a number of solutions here, and it's not sufficient to say this one I don't like. You have to say how to solve the problem and provide us workable solution in order to convince us that there's actually something else that we can do. So we have spent almost a year on this. We had a physical interim on this. We had several virtual interims on it. This is what we came up with at the end. So please, If you work out on a solution, look at the drafts that people wrote, look at the minutes of those meetings in order to check whether your solution actually addresses those requirements, and then we can take a look at it. So I think I'm going to push this out as a verify from here, and we'll see how that goes.
Okay, so over to the open issues. We have 3 of them. The first one is Y26, allow mandatory nodes and augment. So the issue here is that when you augment something, it's not possible to add mandatory nodes in your augment. And the reason for that is to let clients that do not know about this augment still work. So if you add something that's mandatory and the client doesn't know about that, the client will fail because he can never create anything because it misses the mandatory stuff. Do you want to comment, Lada?
Yes, I want to comment on this sentence here because I don't think that we can really specify any rules like explain all situations where it makes sense to use mandatory nodes. So my suggestion would be that simply mandatory nodes are allowed in augments, because in fact I can emulate it by using a must statement.
Right, so if we look at
right,
the next thing here, I will show you the 2 proposed solutions, and that is one of them. So if we can look at the issues list. Yes, this is what I updated earlier. So this is more or less, so there are 2 proposed solutions. The first proposed solution is to, as Ladislav said, remove this restriction and explain in text that you have to be careful when you augment with what you do. If you add mandatory nodes that the client will not be able to create, then that's going to be a problem. There are situations where you can augment mandatory nodes in a safe way for the client. For example, if you have a when expression on your augment, so you augment something in a certain condition and you can be certain that the client knows this condition. For example, if you have an identity that is defined in the same module as the augment, and you only augment when the type of whatever you're augmenting has that identity, then you know that the client will not be able to create anything unless it understands the identity which is defined in the module that augments. So as Ladislav said, even in Yang 1.0 you can break all the clients by using evil must expressions, like in this example. If you augment the interface list with a container Ethernet where you say must speed and then you have your leaf speed, that must expression essentially makes the leaf mandatory, even though you don't have a mandatory true statement on the leaf itself. So if you want to be evil, you can do this today, and therefore it might make sense to remove this rule. So that's one of the options we have. The other option is Y2602, which is more or less don't do anything, keep this rule, and there's a workaround. If you want to add a mandatory speed to an Ethernet interface, surround it with a presence container, so when the client creates an interface of this type, the speed will be mandatory only if it also creates the Ethernet container in this case. So that's what you will have to do today. You can do this already. And this proposal is to just keep that. So any comments on these two proposals from anyone?
So you're saying you can add that, and going back to your example, you can add that must statement in the new revision of the module? That's not what section 10 of 6020 says.
No, this has nothing to do with new revisions of modules or anything. Could be the first revision of a module, right?
But so if that's the first revision of the module,
Yes.
then somebody using this module will know about it.
Yeah, but the problem is if you don't use this module, but you create an interface of that type, and you don't understand, this speed thing, you have never seen that module as a client, you try to commit, so you create an interface of this type, and the server will complain because you haven't provided the speed.
But this seems different. The case I'm worried about is a client's working with module X that's been working for a long time. Now the vendor introduces module Y and breaks module X.
Right. And that's,
I don't see that happening here.
yeah, because module X in this case is the interface, and the new module that you talked about is this one that has this.
Right.
So your client works with interface module.
He's augmenting a module, so he has to know about the augmented module.
Right, so the client knows the interface list, and the client can create the interfaces of this type, Ethernet, and that works fine. And then the vendor adds this module, and all of a sudden the client doesn't work anymore.
Yeah, I guess I'm not seeing it the same situation where you can't predict the combination of modules that will occur in a server, and that can change over time. So I don't think we should be breaking these old modules by adding mandatory things. I think wrapping it in a presence container or something like that is
good enough?
Is good enough.
Yeah.
There are two things actually. Adding a presence container means that the data are still not mandatory under an Ethernet interface, so it doesn't really help. And of course, this, in my opinion, doesn't help anything. And second is that there is actually now a number of ways how a module writer can break almost everything. And for example, with when expressions, and there were other long discussions about when expressions, and we sort of converged to a solution where we believe that module writers do sensible things and don't want to break things arbitrarily. And I think it's pretty much the same case. If a module writer is aware of what are the implications of making some nodes mandatory in an augment, and as you said, this should be specified in some guidelines, I think that we can rely on common sense of module writers, and I think that it should work. Because in many cases, really, in the way our data models are really built by using augments in a very important way, right? So it's not like an augment just add some optional stuff here and there. It's really a very fundamental way of building up our modules from smaller parts. And in this case, if we don't have this option to be able to specify the schema in a stricter way, I believe we are losing something, some important capabilities. So
we're losing some expressiveness, yes. Phil?
Vlad, are you saying that the container in the second case, in the second solution, or the first solution is mandatory? I couldn't understand.
Because if somebody creates that interface with that type Ethernet, then the container presence needn't be present, right? So there needn't be anything about Ethernet in that because presence container is only created when it is created.
Right, so
of
that
course,
is-
after you create that, you are some mandatory, so it's sort of better, but at the expense of having an extra container, which sometimes might be there anyway, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, this solution requires the client to actually create this Ethernet settings or Ethernet container. But the idea is to stuff all these Ethernet-specific things in there. So, yeah, it gives an additional container, but it solves the problem. So,
So yes, there's a cost to the container, but the benefit is that the contract, which was represented by the original Yang module, holds. And I think that's really the thing that matters here. You know, we're presenting these as fixed APIs, and if your fixed API can change because somebody augments you, and you know you can't hold a box to the rules of the module that it says it implements, that's when you get into issues.
any other comments? So, looking at the chairs.
So I've heard some people speaking up in solution number 2, and fewer people in solution number 1 or not having any rule for augments in the future, right? That's what Lada wanted, right? Can we get a feeling of the room of who thinks we should simply allow augments without any constraints? You can show your hands or hum or dance. Okay. Who thinks we should go for solution 01? Yeah, that's the one that I just asked for. So the other option is on the table is solution 02, which says we don't change it, so you can't augment mandatory. However, there are certain workarounds that come at the expense of using presence containers in order to scope the augment, the mandatory to the presence container. Who is in favor of that solution? Okay. +1 on Java. So that seems at least the feeling is leaning towards O2. Probably we'll have to then verify whether that flies on the mailing list, or whether, like, give Lada some time to think whether there's any major obstacle that we should consider which we didn't consider. But it seems to be leaning towards O2 at the moment.
So it might be a good idea also to update our design patterns document with that solution. Okay, the next open issue is 36. Associate the notification with the data node. That means being able to inline notifications and not only have them on the top level. So currently you can define notifications, but you always have them on the top level in the module. And this proposal is to be able to associate the notifications with the data that you're modeling and put them in line in that definition. For example, if you want to have a notification for an interface, you know, link down or something, you can, with this proposal, you could put that notification where you define your interface list, in the interface list. So I guess this one was actually first closed, and then we reopened it because of symmetry reasons, where since we now allow inline actions, it might make sense to also allow inline notifications. And did we have, how many solution proposals are there? Oh, okay. Right. Okay, so there are actually two. There were two solutions. So the inline solution is the other one, or two that I mentioned. Another potential solution to the same problem is to still keep all the notifications on the top level, but indicate with a new statement which data node is associated with that particular notification. So I'm actually not clear how that solves anything, because that seems you could do the same thing without that new path statement.
Yeah,
Could you
Andy
comment on that one?
One of the rationales for the actions was that it allowed more granular access control. And the same applies here.
Right.
You could do things like on an edge router, you could say this client is only allowed to get this notification for his own interface.
Right.
You can't possibly do that now.
Right.
So it does enable, finer-grained access control. The argument for actions was that it also enabled, like CLI and things like that to have context-specific help. That doesn't apply here, but...
Right. Yeah, it also helps if you do something like the mount thing that I think is going to talk about later, where a model is mounted somewhere else. You can actually do that if you have even notifications on the top level in a mounted module could be viewed as inline. So I think the only problem here is that we don't have a concrete proposal for how to encode things. In this solution 02, it's pretty clear how you would define it in the data model and how access control will work and all that. But how those notifications are encoded in netconf in a way that's compatible with 5277 notification specification, I don't think that's clear. Or did we have, further down in this, do we have a proposal for how to encode stuff? All right, so the first one is, so I think the inline thing means that notifications are scoped like other data nodes. So you need some kind of generic encoding. So in this proposal you would encode the hierarchy just like you do for normal data, and then comes so first you have the interface instance hierarchy, and then comes the notification interface enabled, and then it's all the parameters for that notification. I think we have to work on that. I'm not sure that this solution works, but something like that could probably be made to work. Needs to be compatible with the notification RFC. So does anyone have any comments on this in general? If it's a good idea to support this or not? Or specific comments on inlining or the encoding?
Is it possible to get some volunteers to sit together sometime during the day today and work out and look at the encoding, and then probably have more concrete worked out solution proposal? Anybody willing to join such a would work probably after 3 p.m. It would work for me, yeah. Okay. So if people are interested, then we meet after the coffee break in the afternoon at the registration desk, and probably can work out a proposal to make progress. I really want to have this resolved. Jabber,
but as is this only for symmetry, then I don't support it.
Well, as Andy said, there's an added value in simplifying access control on notifications, because they are scoped to something that is a meaningful resource, right? Okay, then that's probably what we're trying to do, so we try to see whether we can come up with a more concrete proposal and then see whether we can resolve that during the week.
Okay, the last open issue is non-unique leaf lists. So I think that solutions 1 and 2 are not really active. I think they are they're dead. So this is, Balash wrote this text. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know. So the idea is so currently leaf lists only support unique values within the list, ordered or unordered. So the proposal is to also allow non-unique values in a leaf list. And there are a few examples of this. List of AS paths and the queuing rates. I haven't seen that example before, but yeah, I don't know. What do people have any comments?
Balazs says in Jabber, is solution 3 is really an updated version merging 1 and 2.
Okay.
Clarification of the question.
Yeah. So personally, I'm a bit concerned that we add quite a lot of extra stuff for a rather small use case. It's not that clear how you modify a list with multiple or duplicate values in it.
Andy Bierman, actually, Martin, you brought up an issue last time that made me think that this can't work, which is due to access control, position 3 may not be what position 3 really is to the server. So I don't want my server to have to go through all the instances and come up with a different numbering for each client based on
Yeah, that's certainly complicated.
no, actually, we found out that they'd either get access to the whole leaf list or none. But position, if it changes, there's no detection. So,
Right.
and if you change by value, really in a leaf list, it's kind of a derivative case of a list where the only thing in the list is the key itself. And so
Yeah.
we'd be changing that so that now the key has to be the position, and it's no longer the old way. So.
Right, then you have to modify by position all the time. Right.
I agree that this non-unique leaf lists don't make much sense for system-ordered leaf lists, but there are, as it is mentioned here, for example, AS path, it's just normally used, and a workaround would be just to use a list instead of a leaf list, and invent some arbitrary key for that. And given that these AS path may be quite common and in quite large numbers in a configuration, I think it would be really helpful in this particular case to be able to specify leaf lists without this uniqueness requirement. So maybe my proposal would be to restrict this only to user-ordered.
I think it is restricted to user-ordered lists.
Uh-huh.
But I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, Bala says, yes, leaf level access control is a bad idea. Don't use it, forbid it. I tried to clarify the rules, no one came up with a problem lately. I can live with the restriction.
The restriction of just for user order lists, I assume.
So how many people have actually read all the text? So the solution description is relatively lengthy and very detailed, which is appreciated because it actually tells us where things have to change. But how many people have read it? Okay. And out of those who have read it, they think that's okay, implementation-wise.
You mean you support it or?
Well, whether it's complete in the sense that it's a complete solution that we can adapt if we want to do this at all. So those who have read it think that's a complete solution. Or they don't have an opinion. Okay. So the basic question is, do we want to add this feature? Or do we not want to add this feature, right?
Yes.
Let me remind you we had another issue which was about lists that would be unkeyed. We went over that a couple of times and at the end declared that issue dead because it caused significant changes to the way instance identification works, and we didn't want to do that for Yang 1.1. And this seems to be related because it's at the end the same thing. You have a list of leaves, and they are now kind of identified by their position and addressable by their position, which they are currently in Yang 1.0. They are not addressable in this way. And so that's a significant change of how we do things. And the question is it necessary to do it? Yeah, there is the ASN, the path, ASN path example where it might make sense, but there might be other ways of modeling it, making it a list. So I would like to get a feel of how many people think we should actually do this change and go to a situation where we can address things by position and modify them by position, or whether we keep consistent with the old Yang 1.0 rules where this wasn't possible. So who thinks we should actually go there and make things addressable by position and leave lists? Okay, who thinks we should not go there? So that was just roughly 1 against a few. Yeah? But, and I guess Bala's, I can predict what he, how to count his voice. That's not very strong, I would say. So I'm not sure how to proceed on that.
Actually, instance identifier and access conditions is quite different because we currently do support instance identifiers for leaf list values.
For values?
Yeah.
For values?
Yes. I'm pretty sure we have to do
Phil Schaefer. So this is another instance of an ongoing problem. How do we decide what to add and what not to add? There are lots of things that could be well represented with existing Yang things that we've decided to add to the Yang language to support. In particular, I'm talking about the context notifications and the context actions. Those could easily be done with existing mechanisms, but we decided to do this. Here's something that can easily be done with existing mechanisms, it looks like we're deciding not to, that how is there a criteria that we have here?
There's no overarching magic bullet. We go one by one, and we try to understand the trade-offs. And sometimes there are reasons that make us go into one direction and not in the other direction. But there's no magic bullet that answers all our questions. Otherwise, we would have already been done, I guess, in July last year. So it's a complicated process to find out and understand the difference. And sometimes it's side effects like access control issues that actually make you think that that's actually a worthwhile solution because it's having an impact that it allows you to do something different than some of the other solutions. On this thing, it's not so clear-cut what the trade-off is between adopting it and not adopting it, I think, at the moment.
So if you don't adopt it, then the modeler has to make an artificial key. That's the cost. If you adopt it, then we need to think about how to do position-oriented things. There's a lot of plumbing that has to happen. There's a lot of examples. There's a lot of cases that need handled, and those will need debated. For example, in the text that's supplied, he talks about, when you delete something, you delete the first occurrence of it, and if you want to delete multiple occurrences, then you put multiple keys in multiple times. So if there's 100 and you want to delete them all, you have to list 100 values of A. And to me, that's very surprising. If I said delete A, if we allow this feature, and I said delete A, I would really want all my A's gone, not merely the first one. And in fact, the whole idea of that kind of manipulating sub-members of a list like that, where it's really just positional, seems awkward.
Well, that's something that we don't do anywhere else. Yeah, so that's what I understand.
Bert says, to me it seems a 2-2 vote is not a strong position to add, and I hear it can be done with existing language, so I would say do not adopt it.
Who was that? Okay. Well, that probably is in terms of Balash, I guess.
Yes. Already today we have no way to handle leaf list as a unit. I didn't want to change it. It could be done.
So it could be done is probably not sufficient. Yeah. So we need to see the value that it brings in terms of the cost that it has. And the change is, I think, the change to the language is not just a simple change. It's bigger than it might look at the surface, and even at the surface it looks like a longer change than just a simple change. So we need to understand the trade-off of what is the added value of doing that. So what kind of situations does it really allow us to do something significantly better than what we currently have?
Andy Bierman, yeah, one area where it breaks is we don't have like if match in netconf. So if you really want something to be at position 3 in the list and someone moved something in the list before you, your notion of the numbering has changed. Whereas all of the instances, leaf list or list that we have now, are done with permanent keys, so that the name of the instance never changes. It's not possible to leaf list Fred is going to be leaf list Fred no matter if it's position 1 or 10. So doing things by position, now you introduce a problem where you have to be able to say, I'm editing this representation of that leaf list, and we don't have that in netconf, so we need to support that.
Bert says, so for a big or not so simple change, I would think you need more than 2 people in favor.
And Bert has experience. So it seems at the moment it feels like we are not going to do this. But sure, we'll have to verify that on the mailing list and in particular see whether Balash can live with that. You know, the idea is not to make everybody happy, but to find a solution and to deliver at some point in time. You want to say something about the new issue with the coexistence, or you want to talk about?
I can just mention that. So there's one issue that is marked as new, and that is the coexistence with Yang 1.0. At some point in time, probably very soon, we need to address what we do with Yang 1.0. So the very first thing to think about is, will Yang 1.1 actually obsolete 1.0, or just be a new version of Yang that can exist or coexist with Yang 1.0. So for the SMI, for example, SMI v2 does not obsolete SMI v1, and it's probably a good idea to do the same here, I would think. That is, introduce this as a new version of Yang, but the old one still exists, and old modules can still be used. The other issue is how we deal with imports. It seems to make sense that it should be okay for a new 1.1 module to import something that's defined in Yang 1.0, because otherwise we'd have to update all the existing modules already, like the INA types and Yang types and all those. And then you have the other way around. Is it okay for 1.0 module to import something defined in Yang 1.1? Probably not. But then you also run into some interesting consequences. Suppose we update one of the standard type modules like Yang types, and we add something to it in the future, and it's going to be Yang 1.1 because that's the current version. What does that mean for servers that want to support old modules and new modules at the same time? So you have some old modules that import the 1.0 version of Yang types and new modules that import the new version. It's this whole conformance thing again, but on a new dimension, which is the version of the language itself. So I think we just need to keep track of this and think about it. Does anyone? So we should open this issue. It's marked as new right now, but I think we need to do something, or we need to do something. And the question is what we do. Anis.
Yeah, just one comment, thinking out loud a little bit, but this problem is one that is certainly important, but we're talking about it a little bit as if the kind of deployments and usage is so widespread that it would be a problem for so many implementers and servers and model writers, etc. I'm wondering if, given the stage that we're at in the adoption and deployment of this stuff, that we could do something simpler, like in fact consider obsoleting 1.0 if 1.1 is really making improvements, if it affects so few implementations currently.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the implications would be if we actually obsolete them on the server.
I think the procedural question of whether that's obsoleting 1.0 or not at this point in time is the less problematic one. Sure, we have some data models published, and we're likely not going to republish them just for the sake of updating them to 1.1. So we're likely not going to obsolete Yang 1.0 until those documents have been revised anyway, naturally. We might have put a rule in place that all new documents need to be 1.1, so that we essentially only have a few legacy documents that we need to, at some point in time, wrap up, and then we can retire Yang 1.0. I think that's a relatively straightforward process, I think, unless
Dan Bogdanovich. I'm curious on the open source and other consortiums that they're using, and what would mean, for their documents, if we want to use their documents and they want to use our documents. So, so leading 1.0, I think we should leave some kind of possibility of, tying them together, because there's already so much out there, and just for us internally it will be easy because we don't have many documents, but there's a substantial number of documents outside of the IETF.
Yes. I think what we need to do at this point in time, we should just find agreement that we really treat this as an open issue. The precise text that goes into this section likely will be written at the end, when we actually have the edits in place for all the other issues and we understand what exactly the versioning and import issues might be. So at this point in time, I think the question is really just to accept it as an open issue, which I assume is likely not a big deal. Andy?
Yeah, I agree with you. It is an open issue. I have tried to put a little thought into what it would be, what's involved in introducing the first Yang 1.1 module into a working system. It's not a good situation. You really have a lot of stuff that has to upgrade. And then we're in a situation where you can't, as you pointed out, you can't put anything in that new 1.1 module that you want to be reused by the system, because then you have a whole mix of 1.0s that absolutely cannot import a 1.1. Because if my 1.0 compiler is conformant, it is going to stop as soon as it sees Yang version 1.1. It's done, or it's not even going to continue. So to say that a 1.0 module now can only be compiled by a 1.1 compiler seems to break 1.0. So we're in a situation where we really can't make reusable modules until 1.1 is like fully deployed.
Okay, so back to the question. The proposal is on the table to formally mark it as open. Is anybody having an issue with that? Okay, then we'll track it and try to come up with more concrete wordings as we finish the document. I think it's fine to have this as the last open issue until we ship the final version. You had a question concerning one of the issues. Can you quickly ask that, or we're a little bit short on time? Or do you want to ask that on the mailing list? Okay, then we do that on the mailing list. Then we're done with 1.1. Any specific question that you want to raise concerning Yang 1.1 at this point in time? Otherwise, we move to Andy.
There's a video, okay. Let's see if I can find my slides. I am going to be talking about the Yang conformance, not Yang conformance, the guidelines, 6087 biz. And the issues are kind of fluid because they very much depend on what we do in Yang 1.1. Okay, so I'll just go over some stuff. I tried to go through the mailing list. Have not had a chance to update the draft yet. I definitely will do it this month. I'll try this week to get the draft up to date. So there's been a lot of discussion sometimes on mailing lists. We can't really make a rule in Yang about that, but we can push that into the usage guidelines. So I'll go over some of the things, the big issues that have been on the mailing list recently. Next. This concept of auto numbering and enumerations in position. So Jürgen suggested on the mailing list that we could have a guideline that says that IETF modules have to be explicitly numbered. This makes it clear that a number has been defined, and then in new versions of the module, the number is not allowed to change. this doesn't really help the corner case of these auto-generated enumerations or something from a IANA registry or something. They still have to make sure that they're not reusing a new value through some implementation magic. So I guess the discussion point here is if this helps or just adds busy work to the module, or I don't know if we've resolved the auto numbering in 1.1. We resolved it as leaving it the way it is. So this would be a guideline that's in addition to that. So any comments on we should do this or not? Doesn't sound like there's support for this. 0 comments. So then that's suggesting we don't need a guideline for auto numbering, or basically to not have auto numbering, to have explicit numbering. Okay, well, moving on to the next one. This is some discussion on Yang doctors. I don't think there's any controversy here that we should have some guidelines on how to put an example module in a draft. And I put copyright on the list here because I'm not sure what the convention should be if the full IETF trust copyright needs to go in example modules or not. I don't know that we've been doing that, but there's a few issues with this. We want tools that do module extraction to know the difference between an example and a real module. That's a pretty important feature. And then the rest of it is just conventions on how to do it. So we'll be adding something in the new version on this, and I guess I'll ask the Yang doctors what the actual text should be. Next. Conditional nodes. This was the issue, I forget the number, that allow the keys. So the proposal from LADA was that the key leaf is not allowed to have a when or if feature on it, because keys are mandatory and you can't have the key be optional. In reality, the key must be the same degree of conditional factors as its parent. And the only way to really do that is to just basically cut and paste the when expressions or if feature expressions from the parent to the key leaf. This is redundant, doesn't add information, but it is legal. So this was the issue I had with LADA's proposal. But we could have a Yang guideline that says that in IETF modules we won't allow this.
I don't have this copy and paste, of course, doesn't work because you have different context nodes. So
that's true. That makes it. That was one of the reasons why we objected to figuring out that the when statement would produce the exact same result set as the parent node. That's like really complicated.
One thing that it's really difficult to determine whether the when constraints are stronger or weaker or the same. And second thing is that if you have such a when condition on a parent, then there is no need to specify it on the key, right? So I don't see any.
Okay. A server will get, if you try to create a list entry that has a when statement on a key that's false, hopefully the server is going to reject that because you haven't provided all the keys.
But actually I think that we decided on the issues list to not allow this for keys. I think that's the current consensus.
Right, but then I pointed out that it's allowed in 1.0, so then how does a 1.0 module remain conformant? I want to avoid the situation that if I just change the Yang language version to 1.1, that nothing breaks. Okay,
but
so
something
if
with-
all I did was change the language version, and now I have a legal stuff in my module, I have a problem with that.
But why is that a problem? I mean, we already have some things that will break one, or could break one of your modules. This would be another of those. And is that really a big problem? I mean, if you added that version and you try to compile it, the compiler would complain about some things and you would fix them, and that's it, right?
Well, the server can figure out the if feature situation. That's not the problem, but it's only half of the conditions, so
Right.
it doesn't solve the full problem.
Doesn't.
Well, I'm okay with having a Yang guideline that says you can't do this, but I'm not so sure that changing making that 1.0
So then we need
illegal.
to reopen that issue.
The larger question is, do you need to specify
1.0 guidelines versus 1.1? No, I hope not. I don't want, well, I remember back in the S&P days, we did not continue using SMI v1 once v2 was published. We stopped doing it. So even though technically it wasn't obsolete, it effectively was. Yeah, no, all right, well, if I guess I'm in the minority on this, and we'll have to do that. It is mostly theoretical because there's no real good reason for doing this. Because if you do make the key conditional, then the server should rightfully reject it, because all the keys have to be provided in Yang. I guess, so Martin, what you're saying is we don't really need a guideline because you're going to enforce it in Yang 1.1?
Yeah, I think that was the solution.
Okay. Okay, so, it's unfortunate, but we're going to have a situation that Yang 1.0 modules will have to be modified to be used in 1.1. Where do we have that? Oh, okay, I'll repeat. It was the way that strings, escape characters and strings. It is kind of minor, but this is minor too, because this really isn't a use case. This is just a corner case. Okay, so I guess the resolution on this is we won't have a guideline because it'll be a rule in Yang 1.1. Augment with mandatory nodes. So if we allow this in Yang 1.1, which looks like we're not, then we would have a guideline. We'd have to have guidelines that says what you're allowed to do. And it's, well, the reason we haven't been able to do this in the interim is to come up with an exhaustive list that's bulletproof is rather difficult. We've discussed that if you have when type equals new identity, then the old client won't know about this new identity, so it won't try to create the entry with type equals the new identity, and that protects you from that client inadvertently, adding this mandatory node. There's other things like if feature. I've thought through it, and if feature actually isn't one of them that's safe, because the client has no control over what features the server's going to advertise. But it doesn't sound like we're going to make a lot of progress working on coming up with this text to put in 1.1. So I guess we don't need this guideline either, because we're not adopting the change. Okay, next one. This is a second slide on this. I'm not so sure that it's actually safe for old clients to read the new values. The bullet there. If you're adding mandatory nodes, then can they really be safely ignored when you're reading the entry back? It seems like it would have been optional if it could easily be ignored. But saying it's mandatory, clearly not something that can be ignored by the client. All right, so that's not an issue anymore. 64-bit numbers and XPath, this came up, and we need guidelines that say not to do this. Don't use uint64 and id64. And then there's only a range of values, I guess, that are safe in decimal 64, so I'll add a guideline for that. And then it would be nice to have Yang check this. So in IETF mode, it will get flagged in ID nits. Next one. Any XML usage. So these are all the controversial topics from 1.1, and I don't really see a good answer with any XML other than to have guidelines that say that we've looked into it and it doesn't seem that any two vendors implement this the same way. Or if they are, we haven't really deterministically verified the implementations behave in the same way with any XML used, especially when it's used as a config equals true object.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I actually had a comment on the previous slide about the 64-bit numbers. There's actually text in 6020 bis around this as well. That was agreed.
Okay.
I think Jürgen suggested some text and I put it into the 6020 bits, so
also we don't need a guideline?
Might not be necessary here. You can check that text, but
okay,
make sure that it covers this.
That's fine. All right, so I think we can have a guideline about any XML that describes its usage as in mixed mode, and I don't know what to really say except that it may not be interoperable because implementations don't support it. We really use any XML in RPC statements and things. That's where it's used in the standard. It's not used as configuration node. It's antithetical to the whole concept of having a schema-defined data model. What any XML is, if it's a config equals true node, is it's just a hole in your data model that says, here's something that has a name, and that's all it has. It has a name, and you can get it back. But it's no interoperability to it. So we're not going to try very hard to wordsmith any XML. It is what it is. I still am not super clear on the differences between any XML and any data, but I hope the new Yang draft will make that clear. All right, next slide. So I'm going to go through the mail archives again and find missed issues and come up with a new draft. And there was a request to add more examples to the guidelines, which I'll try to do. It's not really intended to be a tutorial to teach Yang to people. So the fact that there's no book on how to do this is not really this RFC's problem. This RFC is guidelines to reviewers of Yang documents, people who are supposed to already know Yang. So I understand it could be perceived as a training tool, but that wasn't its intent. Okay. Any questions, comments?
Benoit Claes. So first of all, state your name whenever you come to the mic, and please come to the mic for discussions. Now, I would like to come back to the example, to extracting examples, right? So we've been doing a tool to extract Yang models, and it's true that we wanted to just not look at examples because the example should not have code begins and code end, right? So this is a good practice. However, it was mentioned that somehow examples that are Yang related should be Yang validated, right? So we need to solve that one. Now there are two ways to solve that one. Either we have a prefix telling example dash, that could be a good convention, or there was like a proposal on the Yang.to list like this morning to have like example begins or example end.
Now, I was checking this with ISG real quick. I was wondering where the code begins convention comes from. It comes from the legal provisioning relating to IETF documents. So basically, I double-checked, and the thing is, it relates to the code license. Now, there is no code license with examples. So the conclusion is that if we want to have our own tag to say example begins, we could have that one.
Okay.
So one of the two solutions would work.
Okay.
Jürgen Schimmelder, as someone who knows the history of how this was invented, this had only to do with automatic extraction. It had no concerns about licensing or non-licensed code. It was, we had SMI strip which did the same thing for SMI modules. In Yang, we couldn't do it in the same way because it's harder to identify the beginning and the end, and that's why we came up with this. As a pure markup, here's something to extract. It's not tied into license issues. At least it wasn't until now.
Right, so there is some text mentioning that on the Trust website. I'll forward this to the list, and I don't want to read it. But whatever, we need to solve that issue one way or the other.
Dan Bogdanovic, using the tag would be easier than using, just a prefix in the name. So, and it would stay in this, in the same compliance as we have it for other code.
And one more thing, there is this funny convention to have acme as prefix for examples. Now, I just heard that we might be having a new working group called acme. So that will confuse again things with a prefix.
Bert says an example does not have to be a complete module, so it may not compile clean, right?
Yes. I think we need to settle this and we'll figure this out, but I don't think we need to necessarily do it here. So I would rather move on. There are a number of things to consider, but we'll find a solution. I'm optimistic about that. Lada, are you coming up?
Okay, good morning. This draft is about JSON encoding of data model with Yang. The next slide, please. And here is the list of changes since the revision 01, which is the revision that was presented in Honolulu, and since then there have been two revisions, 02 and 03, and there haven't been many changes. Actually, maybe the most visible one is slight change to namespace encoding for instance identifiers. Otherwise, all the changes are mainly clarifications. So, and I will show an example of how the namespace encoding looks like. Other than that, so firstly, the formulation of the rules for namespace encoding are now written so that they don't use RFC 2119 language, because there were some objections about whether this language is appropriate. So now the rules are just stated in a positive way. The rules are this and this, and I think it should be clear how it is supposed to work. And one real change, as I said, is that namespace encoding for instance identifiers was adjusted to be essentially the same as the encoding for of namespaces for nodes in the data tree. And then there was a request by, I believe, Balázs and Andy, that there should be some text about clarifying that the order of leaf list entries for user audit list has to be fixed, must not change, so that has been added. And then there was, after again a long discussion, I rephrased the specification for NXML encoding so that some things hopefully become more clear. Next slide, please. So these are essentially the rules for namespace encoding. The rules are that for encoding of node names in the data tree, the namespace is here always in JSON encoding is the module name, nothing else. And the namespace has to be present on each top-level node, and then each time the namespace changes. So as you can see, a real-life example using interfaces and IP modules. Here we have to have the namespace on the top-level interfaces container, and then the child nodes and descendant nodes need not have these identifiers as long as they are in the same interfaces module, but as soon as the namespace changes, as it is the case for the IPv4 node, which is in the IP module, then the namespace has to be present, and exactly the same rules are now in instance identifier, so a namespace has to be on the leftmost node in the instance identifier, and then each time the namespace changes. So I think this is a schema that's most friendly for existing JSON parsers, and these rules makes quite a good sense to me, and there are, I believe, technical reasons for adopting this way of encoding namespaces. Next slide, please. So this is just the text copied from the draft about the order of leaf list entry, so you can read it yourself. Essentially, it just said that ordered by properties have to be observed. I think that should be sufficient. Next slide, please. And this is now the text about NXML. Again, although it's sort of a misnomer, NXML in JSON encoding tries to be the same, or to play the same role as it does in XML encoding, which means encapsulating some schemaless data. And of course, these schemaless data are schemaless only from the point of view of Yang. So the data that are being sent may be some, let's say, XML data in some legacy format, but at the same time we can have some JSON encoded data, some legacy JSON encoded data that need to be sent, and so this NXML node could serve the same purpose for JSON. It means that the value of an XML node in JSON can be any JSON value provided it's properly encoding following the rules of JSON. But the second paragraph says that in fact for a particular instance of an XML, of course, because the data that are being sent are supposed to be in some particular format, because that's what the server expects, then of course the server can reject data that do not conform to that, be it in XML or in JSON. So essentially it says that from the point of view of syntax, any JSON value can be sent, but the server of course may select values that are considered valid for that particular XML node. Any comments perhaps on this? If not, then I believe it's the last issue that we had. Now, regarding implementations, this encoding is implemented in REST-conf, and now the Payang implementation implements schema-aware transformation mapping from XML to JSON and back. So, next slide, please. I believe that this JSON encoding is usable. There are currently no open issues, and we have gone quite a long way towards making this encoding friendly for existing JSON parsers. It means that we are now adhering to IJSON. By the way, IJSON became an RFC just yesterday. It's RFC 7493, if I remember correctly. And the second thing is about that namespace encoding. I believe that this particular way of encoding namespaces is also quite friendly for existing JSON parsers. And therefore, I believe the ID should now be ready for working group last call.
Peter Van Horn, quick question. Do you have an idea of when RESTconf may reach RFC status? No idea.
You have to ask other people.
Okay.
Come to the session tomorrow.
Phil Schaefer, I'm so confused about your AnyXML, because you're essentially saying you can put any JSON where any XML is, but the AnyXML is meant to model an arbitrary chunk of XML, and you say the server can reject it, which is certainly true, but I don't understand the rationale behind the current definition.
Well, I mean, if you look at the use cases for using any XML, it's always the case that you just don't want to accept any arbitrary XML data. So if you use any XML for some stuff in netconf, then of course it has to follow some rules. It's just not the case that you accept everything that's well-formed XML. And as for JSON, it's just the same as in XML. It's just any chunk in JSON. So I think it's pretty much symmetrical. It works the same in XML. Just imagine that Yang was designed for JSON in the first place, so we will have the symmetric problem here. The only problem, as I said, is that it's called AnyXML, so it's a misnomer, so it would be appropriate to call it AnyJSON perhaps, but I don't think it's worth the hassle, because we will probably have in Yang 1.1 that any data that will work for JSON modeled data, which is maybe the most important use case for AnyXML these days. So if we keep AnyXML in Yang 1.1, and I think that's the agreement now, then I believe that's just the easiest way how to support sending JSON data that are not modeled with Yang, and it's really symmetrical as in the XML case, I believe.
So you're saying that AnyXML allows you to model any arbitrary data. So a server implementing JSON could implement that in any way they want, including JSON data, or a string, or anything else.
No, the issue of transforming XML to JSON or vice versa is not addressed by this draft. So for any particular use of any XML, the data model has to decide what to do. If perhaps it's even not necessary that this use of any XML is only intended for XML encoding, that there is no need to discuss the translation to JSON. If it's really needed to support both XML and JSON, then the data modeler has to decide what to do. Perhaps, as in the case of RSS, there are both XML and JSON encodings already defined, so then these can be used, or otherwise the data model has to decide about the proper way how to handle this. It can be, as you proposed, it can be that in JSON it's really an like XML serialized string that has to be passed as XML. That's one option, but there are other options, and I think that really it has to be per any XML node. So if there are some rules needed, then they have to be specified in a description for that any XML node. Martin?
Yes, Martin Björklund. So since we're doing any data, wouldn't it make more sense to just do what you just said, encode any XML as a string, a serialized string in JSON? Because with the current definition, it's inherently non-interoperable, right? And if you require all data models to specify in the description clause how this thing is encoded in JSON and maybe other encoding formats in the future, that doesn't seem like a very
but you can also have use cases that you have some JSON format, some legacy, or because now quite a number of JSON formats are being designed, so you can have, I don't know, you can send some database data that are not modeled in Yang, but still they can be in JSON, so there could be use cases where you really want to send JSON data, so I don't think that XML is special in any way, so we just use this any XML for say piggybacking some JSON data that are not modeled in Yang to the server.
But that really changes what NXML is. You said that it's a misnomer, but I disagree. I think it's clearly defined in 6020 what it is. We might not like that, but that's what it is. It's a chunk of XML. So using that to encode, any JSON structure doesn't seem right to me.
Right, but that there are quite a couple of problems when transferring XML serialized data to JSON, because you can have problems with namespaces inherited from some outer scope. So it's not as easy, I would say. And of course, when NXML was designed, there was no notion about JSON encoding. So this is something that we have to decide. But normally, if there is some JSON format that needs to be sent to the server, and if we started with JSON, we would have the same problem. So, but I mean, it's really, any XML is just a way for sending well-formed data in a particular encoding. So if we adopt CBOR encoding, for example, it can be some CBOR data that are just not modeled with Yang. And I agree that as soon as we have any data, and I assume that this will be added to the JSON encoding as well, then most of the problem will be gone. But still there might be use cases where you want to send some data that are encoded in XML and JSON, but they are not modeled in Yang, and that's all.
I'm not sure about that, and also I think that you're changing the semantics of what NXML is by doing this. If you're saying that in the future it might actually mean any ZBOR or any YAML or whatever, that's not how it's defined.
Well, I think that because Yang was really designed for XML, we have changed quite a few things in the JSON encoding. For example, of course, there was no notion of arrays. So the way how we encode lists or leaf lists in XML and JSON is different. So because in JSON you have arrays, so I believe that we just tried to make the JSON encoding the least painful way of using existing Yang infrastructure, essentially.
The step from an array to a list representation is 0. Mm-hmm. So arguing that supports the array, the change from XML to JSON.
Well, I don't agree, because of course in 6020 you have some like that an encoding of a list or leaf list is a sequence of XML elements, right? So this is not a sequence of elements, this is just a JSON array. And there are some implications of this because, for example, in XML you have to deal with the possibility of like interspersing list elements with other sibling elements. This is not the case in JSON. This is impossible. So that was just an example. I'm just saying that. Of course, we can decide to use any XML for like encoding XML data even in JSON. There are problems, so we would have to solve some problems that are inherent in this encoding. But then I think we would also lose the use case. So in this case, I would suggest to add any JSON. Yeah.
Let me jump in here, Jungshan, but I want to ask a question, and that starts different, but it's coming back to the same thing. So the current document says here is a JSON serialization of Yang 1.0. Now in Yang 1.1, we're going to add any data, and the idea is that any data can be made interoperable against multiple encodings. That's the real value of doing any data. Yeah. So encodings can say how we transfer any data because it's constrained to something that we know how to encode and decode, while any XML has lots of stuff that we don't really want to encode and decode. So what is the plan here? Shouldn't the document also cover Yang 1.1 and actually define how any data is encoded? It seems we're adding any data to Yang 1.1 to actually solve these issues. In Netconf, there's a document that's using any XML and has inline, if you do JSON, this is how you encode it. I mean, that's not the way we want to go, right? We want to not encourage people to write in their description statement how something is encoded in XML, CBOR, or JSON, and whatever comes next, right? So it seems any data is the solution to have something that is the generic thing that is interoperable. And I think the guidelines update was kind of saying that within the IETF we're looking very careful of any usage of any XML because we don't really want that because it's having interoperability issues. So should this JSON document not cover Yang 1.1 and provide the tool to be interoperable, despite the question of how any XML is encoded? But I think that the forward path is, for me, more important to that. Right.
Actually, Peter asked about the relationship to RESTconf, and since RESTconf has this encoding as a normative reference, I think that it's more reasonable to publish this draft covering only Yang 1.0 and then publish an update after Yang 1.1 is done.
Yeah. Andy Rearman, I agree, Jürgen. We should just focus on any data. The problem I have with any XML is we declare that it's this just pure raw XML, but nobody has actually demonstrated a server that supports it. So in other words, I can send you, processing instructions, just basically HTML, sent to the server, and the server is going to do something with it. So unless we have any implementations that actually do this, I don't know why we spend a lot of time on interoperability of something that hasn't been implemented. If we cared about moving the Yang to full standard, then this would matter. We don't really do that anymore. So we have something in a proposed standard that isn't being used, isn't interoperable, and we just kind of move on with the correction. But we still need to keep any XML in Yang, which is the confusing part of having both of them in there, I guess. But if that turns out to be clear what it really means, because it really matters to the internal server, taking the off-the-wire encoding and turning it into your internal database. If your internal database has unnamed string nodes in it, that map to arbitrary XML, then that works fine. If it doesn't, then you don't have any place to put them in your database. So that's why there's no interoperability.
So coming back to my question, what do people feel? Should this document stay Yang 1.0 only, or should it cover both Yang 1.0 and 1.1? There's a timing issue here. Clear, if we depend on Yang 1.1, it won't get published until Yang 1.1 is published.
So, Benoit Claire speaking. We have dependencies between RESTconf, JSON, Yang 1.1, and I think that what you propose to just publish those at the same time, because any data has been as a goal, right? So just publishing this one for Yang 1.0 and then updating that a couple of months later does not really make sense, does it?
Yes. My feeling is that we're relatively close with Yang 1.1, that it should be feasible to have it in last call in April, right? Working group last call. And why? Come on. We're done with the issues, and most of the edits are in place, and then you put it in the working group last call. I'm not saying it's immediately done, but it's realistic to assume that we can drive this to completion.
Yeah, Martin Buklund, I agree with that, and we can speed it up by reviewing the current document, because lots of edits are in there that haven't been reviewed yet. So I would encourage people to actually review the current draft. And the other thing is that I also think that we should cover any data or cover Yang 1.1 in this document, the JSON document. So I agree with that.
So can I get a sense of the room? Who thinks we should be covering Yang 1.1 in the JSON document? Raise your arm. Okay. Who thinks we should not do that? Okay, it sounds there's a clear forward. Okay. But there were significantly more hands up for trying to cover JSON as well, and to not do this in 2 steps. Okay.
Okay, so then is the idea, if we do that and just deal with any data, to avoid discussing any XML in JSON?
Well, we still have to resolve the struggle about any XML, but there should be text that says how to encode any data such that it's interoperable. That's the key, and then we have to still settle whether XML is sent as XML or as something. That's still a discussion to settle, but that's really for corner cases done, because the direction is that we do any data and we don't do any XML.
I will be very short because I have just 2 slides for the next presentation. And the next presentation is about a Yang extension that allows for defining syntax of metadata annotations in Yang. So next slide. 0.0 revision was presented in Honolulu, and I think it was Kent who rightly pointed out that in fact, because it's an extension, it cannot be used for defining any behavior of servers and clients, because each party may, or the client may ignore any extension by the rules of Yang. So that was now clearly specified in the new revision, and the extension statement defines only the syntax. That means the name of the annotation, the namespace of that annotation, and optionally the type of that annotation, and that's all. And other means have to be used to negotiate and to state rules for the behavior of clients and servers, such as capabilities or other means, but that's outside the scope of this document. And again, there is one bullet about any XML, encodings. I will show an example. It was necessary to change it to make it to correspond to the JSON encoding draft, and I will explain it on the next slide. And then there was a request to include a feature as a possible substatement of that annotation extension, and I think that's quite a good addition, and there is no reason why not to support this. And here on this second and last slide, you can see the change in the encoding of any XML, and that change was necessary because in the last revision of the JSON encoding draft, any XML became could be any JSON value, so it can be also a scalar value, and it means that we have to encode annotations in the same way as we encode annotation for leaves. So you can see an example here, the full annotation, the metadata object has to be encoded as a sibling to the member that is being annotated by that metadata, and this is the way how it now works. I think it can work quite nicely as is shown here, but of course it depends on the result for any XML encoding in JSON, so it may be still changed in some way. Any questions?
Jürgen Schimmer, let me ask a quick question. We had a call for adoption a couple of weeks or a month ago, and the controversial point of that document was the examples, where people had more discussions about the examples, whether they represent true metadata or something that actually crosses the line to be data. So the idea is, I think the golden rule must be that metadata is data that you can safely ignore without changing any behavior, right? And so if metadata changes behavior, then it's probably not just metadata, because you need to understand what a metadata is, and you can't just delete it. So the question is the document clear about what the purpose is, when to use it and when not to use it, and the examples, have they changed, or are we going to run into the same issue?
I think the document is now clear that this annotation only defines syntax. So for young compilers or young validators, they can be able, using this annotation, to see whether it is syntactically correct. But the way how the annotation is used, so if it is used by the server, the rules that are to be obeyed by the servers and clients have to be specified elsewhere in another document, or maybe using a netconf capability, something like that. So this is really syntax, so it's like some helper function for a young compiler to be able to understand that annotation. How this annotation is used is outside the scope for this. So I believe this issue has been resolved.
Okay, to get a sense of the people in the room, who thinks we should adopt a common encoding for metadata? Raise your arms. Okay, that's a couple of hands. Who thinks we should not do this? See one hand. Any specific reason why you think that should not be done? Go to the mic, please.
Peter Van Horn from Cisco. My experience is that everyone is going to want to have their own metadata. They may want to define it in their own ways, and trying to fit into some specific structure could be a challenge, unless we have examples showing that this is general enough to support anything we need, which of course is something we can't prove.
Well, what this does is giving a common encoding of metadata, not where you place it, what it means, and so forth.
Encoding, yes.
So probably
Okay.
If you can take another look at the document, it would be valuable and if necessary. So I'm going to put up another call for adoption, and probably then take a look at the document and see. Okay? Good. So that's ending the agenda for infrastructure work. Is there any other business on infrastructure work that we need to talk about? Do you want to talk about the weekend experience? Okay, then I will raise another. Then I will raise another issue. I became co-chair in 2010 when Dave Patin stepped down, and I'm planning to step down as well when the Yang 1.1 work is finished. And I'm announcing this now because this might be my last meeting as working group co-chair in this meeting, hopefully, so that people can interact with the guy behind me. And and so I give the floor to
Okay, so thanks already, not for the news, but for what you did. And obviously, we're looking for someone else now, so feel free to ping me, right? Okay, so I want to take a couple of minutes, and by the way, I've been told that this mic works now. Can you hear me now, at the back? Yes, no? Can you? Okay, that's perfect. So actually, part of the IETF 92 hackathon on Saturday and Sunday, we developed a couple of tools. And one of them is about Yang extraction. So the first thing that we wanted to see is what are there are like a lot of Yang models used in the IETF, right? And we wanted to have a kind of inventory of what has been developed, proposed. And also we wanted to have a compilation of all these Yang models. So that's what we did. So next slide, please. And by the way, we wanted to do as well link to world in this hackathon, the open source world and the IETF one. So what we did, the next slide is, and this is done with Jan Medved, there is this page now that shows all the different IETF draft in which there is a Yang model. So we extracted all these Yang models from the latest IETF drafts, and where we have this page with Yang model name, then a quick link to the draft, then an email to the author, just click on that, and whether or not the compilation failed. That is Pyang-IETF. Now, we've been discussing whether we want to have strict as well, and now in the latest Pyang code, Martin added the strict part in the --IETF option, so that's an improvement. So next slide, please. All right, so that's the way to look at this. Go from the Yang model coordination group there, goes in the wiki, and you will find right now it's on my private website, but obviously the goal is to post this somewhere on the IETF website. In terms of numbers, we have like 113 Yang models that are extracting correctly. Out of these, 6 pass the compilation correctly. Now, there is like a small issue with an extra 3 characters that are added whenever a Yang model goes into a draft. So whenever, and that complains, there is a complaint in there, so don't pay attention to that. Now, the next thing, there are 187, in the next slide, that are, this is total of everything. So we discussed the examples before, and that's one of them. But what I want to stress is we've been discovering some funny things. So don't forget to have code begins and code ends if it's not an example. Second thing, try to spell code begins right. We've seen many variations of that. Smaller case without the S in the end with a dash, etc. The next thing is don't forget to put file in there after code begin. This is what is mentioned in the guidelines. By the way, you should have that. And by the way, it should match the module name, but this one is checked in Pyang. Something else, you would be surprised how many Yang models, modules are called XXX, right? So I guess that, if you're not sure about the name now, and don't put XXX because there are 5 or 6 Yang models with the same XXX, so in the tool, the last one wins, right? So And I think the next slide and last slide is next steps. We're going to
So Benoit, so one point you just made that I actually suggested 3 times yesterday is to read the guidelines before you write
yes.
a module, please. That's why Andy and everybody have done all this work documenting this. Please read it.
Even if it's the book on how to write Yang models, there are good guidelines in there, so please make sure that you read this. So we're going to pose the code. The next thing is we're going to have this part of the ID nits. So directly when posting this, the draft, you will see if there are some errors in there. And we want to do the same thing for Open Daylight. There are a lot of models over there. And that's it. Thank you.
Clyde? Did everybody fill out the blue sheets that's in here? If
Great. Next slide, please. So in Hawaii, we received feedback on the IETF syslog model, and we've adopted all 5 feedback items. Very briefly, we added buffered logging. We modified file logging to be a list. We added a destination port field to remote logging with a default value of 514. We improved the description for logging match processing to indicate that the regex expression can be used to match unstructured data tags if needed. And we added a new feature for remote logging to support structured data format distribution. In addition, Jan Lindblad from TailF Systems reviewed the model and made some suggestions which we incorporated. So the status of the model at the moment is that it's ready for adoption, although Martin yesterday told me he has some comments that he's going to send to the list, and I think they're minor comments. Next slide. So at the hackathon this weekend, we implemented the model, and the goal for the hackathon implementation was to use Open Daylight with this model to configure Linux syslog daemon selectors. What we did was we built an Open Daylight project that imports the syslog gang model, and then we wrote an on-data change Java method that reacts to changes to the syslog model leaf paths and rewrites the rsyslog config file. I have a few slides that just shows the demonstration. Senext slide. So if you're familiar with an rsyslog config file, the way it's formatted is that there's a selector portion and then an action portion on each line. In this case, the first selector is a facility of auth and auth priv. All priorities is the asterisk. Send those messages to varlog auth.log. Next slide. So the leaves in the tree that we implemented are the last 4 that are highlighted in bold: the console logging action, the file logging action, the remote, and the terminal logging action. Next slide. And so the way it worked, the way we did the demo is we pre-populated, to save time, 3 of the 4 leafs that we implemented, and then we added the console logging action to the syslog tree using the ODL Deluxe interface. Then we showed the resulting rsyslog config file with the leaf set and with it out set, with it not set. And I've also included the links to the hackathon wiki for Open Daylight and also for the code. It's actually there. It's about 100 lines of Java code. Next slide. So this is the Open Daylight Deluxe interface. It's probably pretty hard to see, but basically down near the bottom, you'll see that we configured the console logging action for logging facility all and warnings. And having filled out this form, the way it works is you select the put button and the leaf is populated. The on data changed Java function will be called, and it recognizes that this leaf changed and it regenerates the config file. Next slide. And this is what the config file looks like. The top one is with the dev console line added. The bottom one is with it out. So they're actually in reverse order. But you see that this file was actually generated with the data that was in the ODL database. And then last thing is probably pretty hard to see, but one of the neatest things that we came across as we were exploring this is that Open Daylight has a visualizer for Yang models, and this is what the syslog model looks like in the Open Daylight visualizer. There are 6 leaves which are kind of that are oriented around the circle, where the circle is the syslog container, and then each of the leaves is surrounding that. And so I urge you to go to the Open Daylight wiki. We have the steps to actually implement this project. Learn about Open Daylight. It's actually very easy to do. I can tell you honestly, a week ago I knew nothing about Open Daylight, and I was actually able to get this done relatively quickly. Thank you. Any questions?
Okay, thanks. Who's next? Andy or Martin, are you going to give an update on the entity MIB DT? About what's going on? I don't think there was a slide. We're just going to talk. So we started a design team a couple weeks ago. Well, they decided to basically work on a Yang version of the entity MIB. This came out of conversations we had around the topology and the inventory.
Yeah. Yeah. You got it. Okay. The entity MIB team hasn't really met yet. Maybe we can meet at this IETF. We haven't
Please do.
tried that. So yeah, all entity MIB team members. This is not working. Well, let's try to meet sometime this week. So what we're going to do is look at the entity MIB, entity state MIB, and then there's entity sensor MIB, and see what needs to be converted to Yang. One obvious problem is OIDs as registration points, and if whatever we convert them to is going to be, a lot of work for an existing implementation. So we're going to have to work out what our expectations are for coexistence with SNMP on this. And so one of my concerns from the start was that we are going to just arbitrarily change OIDs to identity refs or something, and that will be a big enough change in itself to make the Yang version really completely different. But we'll see. I think there is a real challenge in trying to deal with OIDs in Yang. So, well, that'll be the main part of the problem, I think. There's a lot of code out there based on the MIBs that knows these registration points from different vendors, I guess. So we'll be working on that. I think we'll have to also coordinate with topology works to make sure we're not overlapping. There was some amount of overlap in in the different modules?
So, Benoit
Versus
Claes.
I2RS.
So actually, I want to give some background on this one, because in I2RS there is like topology work, and they want to have some inventory in there. And they've been starting to redefine what we've been having in the entity map, you know, and sure, they need this information, but we should do it the right way, with using the entity map as the starting point and create a Yang model out of that, and not having the topology in I2RS full additions one by one of all the things that we need for inventory. This is the background. This is why we have the design team.
Okay.
So I'd like to thank Benoit for saying what I was going to say. Please do the right thing. Andy, what I didn't know that would be helpful, either now or immediately after meeting, is to give me some idea of the time frame on the design team and the constraints, so we can
So
work
the
peacefully.
time frame around the design team, I'm managing that.
Okay.
So these guys are going to meet once a week and try to get things out about every month.
So,
And so maybe in a couple of months, I'm hoping we have something that's pretty reasonable.
okay, and that's a replacement for the entity MIB or I was a little just on,
Not a replacement for the entity MIB itself, but the Yang version of that.
The Yang
And it may
version of it.
actually not even be, one of the things Andy was touching on is it may not even be a conversion. I mean, it may not make sense to just do a one-for-one mapping. There may be things that need to get added around it to make it make sense and things
okay,
like
that's
that. So, but
great.
that's what these guys are exploring. These, you know, that's why they're on the team. They know what they're doing.
Okay, so every month or so you'll push something to a repository, we can take a look at it and we can,
Yeah, I made a space on GitHub for these
Okay.
guys to work in, and anybody can see it as they go.
okay, and you'll push it about once a month, then that'll be the way it works?
Yeah, I'm hoping these guys can send an update about once a month, maybe earlier, you know.
Okay.
But yeah.
And thank you.
Jimmy?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jedong, and I'm going to present this network inventory data model draft. Slides? Okay, first, I'd like to talk about the motivations. The first is the requirements of collecting the inventory information of the network is specified in the topology requirement and the topology use case draft in I2RS. And also during the discussion of the layer 2 topology data model in the I2RS interim meeting, we received the suggestions to separate the topology properties and inventory information to separate the models. That's why we made this draft and define this network inventory data model. Next slide. Okay, this is the architecture of this network inventory model. It's very straightforward. It's based on the generic network model defined in the network topology draft, and with some augments for the inventory-specific information, including the node-specific parameters, capabilities, and some status, and also the list of the components of the network nodes, such as the cards, including the card capabilities and the status, and also a list of interfaces, including the parameters and status of the interface. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is an overview of this inventory data model. Currently, we augment the network module and the node in the network module, including the node-specific parameters and versions information and capability information of this node, and also the capability information of the card and some specific information about the interfaces. Next slide. Okay, since we submitted this draft, we received a lot of comments from the main list. I listed some of the comments here for discussion. The first is it is suggested to separate the young module of the entity map from the inventory. So the design team of the entity map young module just kicks off, and we will work on young version of this entity map, and the inventory module will reference the entity young module. The second comment is we should reference in IETF interface module, and maybe possibly we will augment this interface module also. Another suggestion is to define a base module for the inventory and use augmentation for more specific information related to the inventory. And it is also suggested to add more examples of augmentation in the draft. The last thing is whether or how to describe the generic capabilities of the network nodes and components in this inventory module. We believe that such kind of capability information may be helpful for the network device selection of the operators. And this is also open for discussion. Next slide. So for the next steps, we would like to revise this model and draft based on the feedbacks received. And we will coordinate with the design team of the entity map young module. And we welcome more contributions from the young experts on this work. Thank you. Comments?
Has anybody read the draft? So what do you guys think? I mean, one of the questions that came up was, why is this different than the topology draft that's in I2RS? Why is this needed? And then there's the obvious overlaps, right? So what do you guys think, the people that read the draft?
So I'll give you the I2S reason from our interims. This is just a piece of knowledge from that working group to this working group. Okay, the people who are working, Jean-Med and other people who are working on the generic draft, felt the inventory information was the next step of things they needed to order to do a job. And so we felt my review of the inventory, G's inclusion of that with layer 2 said this is really a separable item. That's what John Med agreed to as well in one of our interims. It's a piece of information that people seem to want to have as they're building their tools. It really doesn't have to be an IR2S thing. In fact, we sent it here. It is something that that group of people who are working on implementations have requested. Is that clear enough? I may be jet lagged still.
Well, one of the questions that came up during the Yangthon was around component reuse, right? We don't want to just go define models that are called different things but are really the same things.
I agree.
And so that was one of the questions that has come up, that when we're looking at doing conceptually, topology and inventory have a lot of the same things. So what I'm trying to get at is, what are the diffs between what's in inventory and what's actually in topology?
Topology, as IR2S is working on, is protocol independent abstract topology, at many sense based on the generic model. Inventory could be considered abstract. It could be considered, I think, maybe closer to actually what's in the node. It is something the people who are working on topology implementations want to have. It's here in Netmod because I think it fits closer to the stuff you're doing, and I encourage G to come here and make sure it aligns with doing the right thing for the entity MIP. So this is not we really want it, it's whatever makes sense for the guys who are working on it. And they seem to think it was the next piece of information they need with the topologies.
Cool. Jan, do you have a...
Did I, please, did I do anything
Yeah,
wrong?
this is actually fits really nicely into the overall topology hierarchy, because the base model is just nodes, and then one branch of that model hierarchy is topology, the other is inventory. So this is perfectly complementary to the topology work that's going on, and it's using the same base concepts. Now, what we need to do with this draft is probably create a proper hierarchy of the inventory models with kind of more abstract models at the top of the tree, and then kind of going and refining the abstract inventory model into individual components or devices or types of nodes or what have you. But this is as far as the topology is concerned and the base topology framework is concerned, this is good work, and it's really complementary to the other drafts that we're doing in I2RS.
Cool.
I support this draft.
Thanks. Benoit, did you have a comment?
Yes, so Benoit Claes, so what I advise you to do maybe, because what I'm missing is if you would read the full entity MIP version 4 and all the different sensor, etc., what are you missing in there that you would need in I2RS? This is what I would like to have as information, right? Because when I see the 3 that you've got in there, there are plenty of stuff that are already in the entity MIP version 4.
Jan,
So you got a comment?
Do you want to catch that one, that Benoit, or shall I?
Sue, do you have a comment? We're way over time here. Okay, so take it to the list. Thanks.
Thank you.
So I think that concludes day one, and I'll see you all tomorrow. I want to thank Jürgen for his help and wish him the best too. Thanks.